In 1992, the largest retail chain in Canada was not Sears. It was not the Bay. It was not Canadian Tire. It was Zellers. 350 stores, coast to coast, from Victoria, British Columbia, to St. John's, Newfoundland. Red shopping carts, the smell of popcorn near the entrance, Club Z points collecting in your wallet like a quiet promise kept week after week. For millions of Canadian families, Zellers was not a store you visited. It was a place you belonged to. Then in January 1994, Walmart crossed the border, and it did not come empty-handed. It arrived with 122 purchase locations, a supply chain that no Canadian retailer could match, and prices that rewrote the rules overnight. Within 2 decades, nearly every Zellers in the country was gone. The stores did not burn down. They were not swept away by a single catastrophe. They were handed over, methodically, deliberately, by the very people who were supposed to protect them. How does the most Canadian store in Canada disappear? Not because it lost, but because the people who owned it decided it was worth more dead than alive. That is the story this video tells. And if you remember those red carts, you already know how much was lost. The story of Zellers does not begin in a boardroom. It does not begin with a business plan or an investor meeting. It begins in 1931 in Hamilton, Ontario, in the middle of the worst economic collapse the modern world had ever seen. Walter P. Zeller was not a visionary in the way that word is used today. He was not trying to disrupt an industry. He was trying to solve a problem that millions of Canadians faced every single day. The problem of needing things they could not afford to buy anywhere else. The Great Depression had hollowed out working-class communities across Canada. Factories had gone quiet. Men who had worked the same job for 20 years were standing in bread lines. Women were stretching every dollar across a week's worth of meals, a month's worth of household needs. The retail stores that existed at the time were built for a different customer, for the middle class, for the comfortable, for people who still had something left after the rent was paid. Walter Zeller opened his first store for everyone else. The original Zellers, the name came from the man himself, was a variety store in the tradition of the five and dime format that had taken root across North America. But where Woolworths and Christie's oriented themselves toward urban shopping districts and fashionable merchandise, Zeller's concept was simpler and more direct. Low prices, practical goods. No pretension. A store where a factory worker's wife could walk in, find what she needed, pay what she could afford, and leave with her dignity intact. The first location was modest by any measure. Wooden floors, counters lined with everyday household items, thread and buttons, kitchen tools, canned goods, work gloves, children's socks. The kind of merchandise that did not photograph well for a catalog, but disappeared from shelves every single day because people genuinely needed it. The lighting was bright enough to see clearly, but not polished enough to make anyone feel out of place. It was, above everything else, an unpretentious room full of useful things at honest prices. What made Zeller's approach different was not the merchandise itself. Variety stores were common enough. What was different was the customer he was building for. In 1931, serving the working poor was not a celebrated retail strategy. It was, in the minds of many in the industry, a limitation. Zeller saw it as a foundation, he believed, and this belief would define the company for the next 6 decades, that the Canadian family of modest means deserved the same reliable shopping experience as anyone else. Not a discount experience that felt like a compromise. Not a stripped-down store that reminded you of what you could not have. A real store, a good store, just one where the prices told the truth. Through the 1930s and into the 1940s, Zellers expanded carefully. New locations opened in Ontario and Quebec, each one following the same formula: working-class neighborhoods, practical merchandise, prices held as low as the margins would allow. The chain grew without fanfare. There were no splashy advertisements, no celebrity endorsements, no grand opening spectacles. The stores spoke for themselves, and the customers who found them kept coming back. By the time the post-war boom arrived in the late 1940s and 1950s, Zellers was positioned in exactly the right place. Canada's working class was growing, factory towns were expanding, Young families were forming households and furnishing them from scratch. They needed everything, and they needed it affordable. Zellers was already there, already trusted, already part of the rhythm of daily life in communities that larger retailers had never bothered to court. Walter Zeller had built something that the retail industry rarely produces, a store with a genuine moral logic at its center. The lowest price was not just a marketing claim, it was a commitment to the customer who had no margin for error, who could not afford to be overcharged, who depended on the store to be honest with them. That commitment would eventually become the most famous promise in Canadian retail history. The lowest price is the law. It would take years for those words to appear on signs and in commercials. But the idea behind them was present from the very first day. Walter Zeller unlocked the door of that Hamilton store and let the first customers in, people who needed somewhere to go and finally had it. The company he built on that idea would grow into something he could not have fully imagined in 1931. It would stretch from one end of the country to the other. It would become part of the way Canadians understood themselves, and eventually it would be taken from them, not by a competitor, not by changing times, but by a series of decisions made by people who never understood what Walter Zeller had actually built. But that story comes later. In the beginning, there was just a man, a store, and a promise to the people everyone else had forgotten. Ask any Canadian who grew up in the 1970s or 1980s what they remember about Zellers, and they will not mention a balance sheet. They will not talk about market share or quarterly earnings. They will tell you about the smell of popcorn near the front entrance. They will tell you about the red shopping carts, wide enough for a small child to sit in the basket, which is exactly where most of them ended up. They will tell you about the snack bar near the back of the store, where a hot dog and a soft drink cost less than $1, and where families sat down in the middle of a shopping trip as if they had nowhere else to be and no reason to hurry. That is what Zellers was at its peak, not a transaction, a destination. By the mid-1970s, Zellers had grown into a genuine national presence. The chain operated across Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces, with expansion moving steadily westward. The stores were anchored in the kinds of locations that defined post-war Canadian life: suburban shopping plazas, small city downtown blocks, and the new enclosed malls that were reshaping how Canadians spent their weekends. Wherever a Zellers opened, it quickly became one of the most visited addresses in that community. Not because it was glamorous, because it was reliable, affordable, and, in a way that is difficult to quantify but impossible to miss, genuinely welcoming. In 1976, Zellers launched the Club Z loyalty program. It was one of the first loyalty programs in Canadian retail history, and it changed the relationship between the store and its customers in a way that no advertisement could have achieved on its own. The mechanics were simple: spend money, collect points, redeem points for merchandise, but the effect was something deeper. Club Z made every shopping trip feel purposeful. The points accumulated in your wallet the way small savings accumulate in a jar on the kitchen counter. Slowly, quietly, until one day there was enough for something real. For working-class families, Club Z points were not a perk. They were a planning tool. Parents tracked them through the fall, calculating what they would have by December: a new hockey stick for a son, a board game for a daughter, something under the tree that would not have been there otherwise. The program turned routine household shopping into something that felt, over time, like a reward. And it bound families to Zellers with a loyalty that went beyond price comparison. The toy section in November and December deserves its own accounting. Those who remember it will tell you that walking into the Zellers toy aisle in late October was a specific kind of experience. Fluorescent light bouncing off cellophane packaging, shelves stacked to the ceiling, the low hum of other shoppers moving through the same dream. Parents brought lists. Children abandoned the lists immediately. The layaway counter at the back of the store ran at full capacity from the 1st of November through Christmas Eve, processing deposits on hockey equipment, bicycles, and boxed games that families would pay off a little at a time over 6 weeks. Layaway was not a financial product. It was a social contract. Zellers was saying, you do not have to have the money all at once. We will hold it for you. What was it about that red cart and that popcorn smell that made a Saturday afternoon at Zellers feel like an event rather than an errand? The answer, in part, was that Zellers understood its customer in a way that its competitors did not. The store was not trying to be aspirational. It was not trying to make you feel like you were shopping somewhere above your station. It was designed as were in its lighting, its layout, its pricing, its staff culture to make ordinary people feel comfortable. And in a country where a significant portion of the population was working class, that was not a small thing. It was everything. The employees were part of that culture. Zellers stores in the 1970s and 1980s were known for low turnover by retail standards. Many employees stayed for years, even decades. They knew the regular customers by name. They knew which items were selling and which were sitting. They stocked shelves with the kind of attention that comes from actually caring about the store you work in. Not because corporate demanded it, but because the store felt worth caring about. In smaller cities and towns, a Zeller's job was considered a good job, stable, unionized in many locations, the kind of employment that allowed a person to build a life. In 1978, the Hudson's Bay Company, the oldest commercial enterprise in North American history, acquired Zellers. On paper, it was a consolidation of two major Canadian retail institutions. In practice, for most of the 1980s, it changed very little about how Zellers operated. The stores continued under their own identity. The management culture remained largely intact. And through the 1980s, the chain continued to grow, adding locations across Western Canada and deepening its presence in communities where it was already the dominant general merchandise retailer. By 1992, Zellers operated 350 stores across Canada. It was the single largest discount retailer in the country. Revenue that year reached its historical peak. The Club Z program had millions of enrolled households. The snack bars were still busy. The red carts were still everywhere. The layaway counters were still processing deposits every November. From the outside and even from the inside, Zellers looked like a permanent feature of Canadian life, as fixed and reliable as the country itself. The kind of institution that endures not because anyone is fighting to protect it, but because it seems impossible to imagine its absence. That is exactly the kind of thinking that makes a collapse possible. Because 2 years after Zellers reached its peak, everything would begin to change. And the first sign of what was coming would not arrive quietly. It would arrive with 122 stores, a Bentonville, Arkansas return address, and a set of prices that Canada had never seen before. The growth of Zellers through the 1970s and 1980s did not happen by accident. It happened because the Hudson's Bay Company, having acquired the chain in 1978, recognized something valuable in what Walter Zeller had built: a format that worked, a customer base that was loyal, and a national footprint that was still far from complete. The decision to expand aggressively was not difficult to make. The math was straightforward. Zellers worked. More Zellers would work more. The expansion strategy followed the geography of post-war Canadian life. As the country's population moved outward from city centers into suburbs, Zellers moved with it. New locations opened inside the enclosed shopping malls that were being built across Ontario, Quebec, Alberta, and British Columbia throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s. These were not small satellite stores. They were full-format anchor locations, large enough to carry the complete Zellers merchandise mix, prominent enough within the mall to draw foot traffic toward every other retailer around them. A Zellers anchor meant a mall had arrived. It meant the surrounding stores would survive. In communities that were too small for a major enclosed mall, Zellers opened in strip plazas and standalone locations. In towns like Sault Ste. Marie, Lethbridge, and Moncton, the Zellers store was often the largest retail employer in the area. It was not uncommon for a single location to employ between 150 and 300 people, many of them part-time workers, mothers re-entering the workforce, students working their first jobs, older workers who needed something stable after a factory closed. The store did not just sell merchandise, it absorbed the employment needs of the communities around it. The mechanics of opening a new Zellers location in this period were relatively straightforward by modern retail standards. Hudson's Bay Company owned or leased the real estate, built out the store to a standardized format, hired a management team drawn partly from existing Zellers locations, and stock the shelves according to a planogram developed at the corporate level. There were no franchise owners, no independent operators, no local partners to negotiate with. Zellers was a wholly corporate operation, which gave it consistency but also concentrated all decision-making authority at the top of the Hudson's Bay Company structure, a fact that would matter enormously later. Through the 1980s, two competitors defined the Canadian discount retail landscape alongside Zellers. Woolco, operated by the American Woolworth Corporation, ran a large-format discount chain that competed directly with Zellers in many markets. Kmart Canada, a subsidiary of the American Kmart Corporation, operated a similar network of stores, particularly strong in Ontario and Quebec. Both chains occupied the same general retail space as Zellers, big box discount merchandise, working and middle-class customers, suburban and small city locations. The competitive dynamic between these three chains shaped Canadian retail for nearly 2 decades. Zellers held the strongest position through most of this period, buoyed by the Club Z program, stronger brand recognition, and better real estate in key markets. But the competition was real, and the margin for error was thin. Then in 1994, something happened that changed the geometry of Canadian retail permanently, and Zellers had been given the chance to prevent it. In the early 1990s, the Woolworth Corporation made the decision to exit the Canadian discount retail market. Woolco Canada, with 122 store locations spread across the country, was put up for sale. For Zellers, this was not merely an acquisition opportunity, it was a strategic imperative. Absorbing Woolco's locations would have effectively ended large-format discount retail competition in Canada and given Zellers a national footprint that no new entrant could replicate quickly or cheaply. Hudson's Bay Company passed. The reasons cited internally involved the cost of integration, the condition of some Woolco locations, and concerns about taking on additional real estate obligations at a moment when the Canadian economy was still recovering from the recession of the early 1990s. These were not irrational concerns, but they reflected a particular kind of institutional caution, the caution of a company that was managing what it had rather than fighting for what it could become. Walmart was not cautious. In January 1994, Walmart Stores Inc. announced the acquisition of all 122 Woolco Canada locations. The transaction closed within months. Overnight, the largest retailer in the world had a fully built Canadian network, 122 stores in established locations, with existing staff, existing supply relationships, and a customer base already accustomed to shopping there. Walmart had not needed to find real estate, negotiate leases, or build from scratch. Canada had handed it a ready-made platform. The initial response from Zellers was measured. Publicly, the company expressed confidence in its brand strength and customer loyalty. The Club Z program, management noted, gave Zellers a relationship with its customers that Walmart would take years to replicate. The pricing advantage Walmart enjoyed in the United States, the argument went, would be harder to maintain in a smaller Canadian market with different supply chain economics. These arguments were not entirely wrong, but they were optimistic in a way that events would not justify. What Zellers had not fully accounted for was the structural nature of Walmart's cost advantage. Walmart's supply chain was not just larger, it was architecturally different. Global sourcing relationships, distribution efficiencies, and cross-subsidization from the enormously profitable American operation meant that Walmart could sustain prices in Canada that Zellers simply could not match without destroying its own margins. The lowest price is the law had been Zellers' defining promise for 60 years. Walmart arrived and made that promise impossible to keep. The expansion machine that had built Zellers into Canada's dominant discount retailer now faced a competitor that had been built on an entirely different scale. And the company that owned Zellers, the Hudson's Bay Company, would soon reveal that its priorities lay somewhere other than the fight ahead. There is a particular kind of institution that exists in every country, one that stops being just a business and becomes part of how a nation understands itself. In the United States, that role belonged at various times to Sears, to Howard Johnson's, to Woolworths. In Canada, through the 1970s and into the early 1990s, that institution was Zellers. This is not nostalgia overstating its case. The numbers support it. By 1992, Zellers operated 350 stores in every province in the country. The Club Z program had enrolled millions of Canadian households, a number that represented not just customers, but families who had made a deliberate, recurring choice to organize their shopping around a single store. In communities from Kelowna to Charlottetown, Zellers was frequently the largest employer, the most visited retail address, and the most recognized commercial name in town. It was not a chain people chose from a list of options. In many parts of Canada, it was simply the store. But the cultural weight of Zellers in its peak years went beyond market share. It went beyond employment figures and Club Z enrollment numbers. It lived in the specific texture of Canadian daily life in a way that is difficult to explain to anyone who did not experience it, and immediately recognizable to anyone who did. The television commercials of the late 1970s and 1980s were part of the national fabric. The jingle was not just catchy, it was ubiquitous. The lowest price is the law played on CBC during hockey broadcasts, during Saturday morning cartoons, during the evening news. Children who had never once thought about retail pricing could sing it from memory. It entered the language the way few advertising slogans ever do, not as a campaign, but as a fact, an assumption. The kind of phrase that stops sounding like a slogan and starts sounding like a description of how the world works. The generational transmission of Zellers loyalty was not engineered by a marketing department. It was organic, and it ran in one direction, downward through families, from grandparents to parents to children, passed along through the simple repetition of shared experience. A grandmother who had shopped at Zellers since the 1950s brought her daughter. The daughter brought her children. The children brought their own children to the toy section in November and stood in the same fluorescent light, looking at the same stacked shelves, feeling the same specific anticipation that their parents had felt in the same store 20 years earlier. This is what brand loyalty looks like when it is real, not a preference, but a habit so deep it has become indistinguishable from memory. The layaway counter in November deserves to be named plainly for what it was. It was a financial service for families who could not access credit or chose not to use it. It was a mechanism that allowed working-class parents to promise their children things they could not yet pay for, and then fulfill that promise over 6 weeks of small payments. The line at the layaway counter in late November, in any Zellers in any Canadian city, was a line of people keeping their word to their kids. That is not a retail function, that is a social function. And Zellers performed it for decades in communities where no one else was offering anything similar. When did a store become something more than a store? And what does it mean when that something disappears? In smaller cities and towns, the Zellers store was often the civic center in a way that sounds like an exaggeration until you understand the geography. In a town of 15,000 people with one main commercial street, the Zellers was where you ran into your neighbors, where your daughter's soccer coach worked on weekends, where the church fundraiser bought its supplies, where you stopped after the hockey game because it was open late and warm and familiar. The store functioned as a kind of public living room. Neutral ground, accessible to everyone, requiring nothing of you except that you show up. The employees who worked in these stores through the peak years describe a specific culture that is worth preserving in the record. Zellers in its prime was not a prestigious employer by any external measure. The wages were modest, the work was physical, the hours were irregular, but within the stores themselves, there was a pride of place that showed in how the merchandise was handled, how the floors were kept, how customers were greeted. Long-tenured employees, those who had been with the same location for 10 or 15 years, took the store's reputation personally. When a shelf was properly faced, when a customer found what they were looking for, when the layaway paperwork was processed without error, it mattered to the people doing it. That culture of investment, quiet and unspectacular, was one of the things that made Zellers stores feel different from purely transactional retail environments. By 1992, all of this was at its fullest expression. The stores were well stocked. The Club Z program was generating genuine customer engagement. The brand was trusted from one end of the country to the other. A Canadian family choosing where to spend their household budget had reasons, emotional, practical, and financial, to choose Zellers. 2 years later, Walmart would be in 122 Canadian locations, and those reasons would begin to erode. But in 1992, none of that had happened yet. In 1992, Zellers was exactly what it had always promised to be: Canada's store, built for Canada's families, rooted in Canada's communities. A place that had earned its place in the national life, not through advertising or acquisitions, but through 60 years of simply showing up and doing what it said it would do. The lowest price is the law. For 60 years, that law held. What came next would break it, and the breaking would not come from outside. It would come from within. In the fall of 1993, a Zellers store manager in Mississauga, Ontario, noticed something he had not seen before. The Walmart that had opened nearby, one of the first converted Woolco locations, was drawing customers he recognized. Not all of them, not even most of them, but some. Regulars. People who had been coming to his store every week for years. He watched them come back eventually. The prices at Walmart, they told him, were lower on certain things. Not everything, but enough things that it was worth the extra drive. He filed a report upward through the management chain. He was not the only one. Across the country, in every market where a converted Woolco had become a Walmart, Zellers store managers were observing the same pattern and sending the same message. The customer was beginning to compare, and in a retail category where the entire value proposition rested on price, comparison was dangerous. The response from Hudson's Bay Company headquarters was measured, confident even. Zellers had Club Z. Zellers had 60 years of customer loyalty. Zellers had a Canadian identity that an American chain from Arkansas could not purchase or replicate. The official position was that Walmart's entry into Canada, while competitive, was manageable. Zellers would hold its customer base through the strength of its brand and the depth of its relationships. This was not an irrational position in 1994. It would become one by 1997. What the Hudson's Bay Company did not fully reckon with, or chose not to reckon with, was the structural permanence of Walmart's price advantage. Walmart's supply chain in 1994 was not comparable to anything operating in Canadian retail. Global sourcing relationships built over 30 years. Distribution infrastructure that reduced cost at every point between manufacturer and shelf. And critically, the ability to absorb losses in Canada while the American operation generated profits that dwarfed the entire Canadian retail market. Walmart was not competing on price in Canada the way a local competitor competes on price, by finding efficiencies and passing them along. It was competing on price the way a government competes, by having resources so large that the math simply does not apply in the same way. Zellers could not win that fight with the tools it had. What it needed was investment in supply chain modernization, in store renovation, in inventory management systems that could respond to Walmart's pricing moves in something closer to real time. That investment required money, and money required Hudson's Bay Company to make a decision about what Zellers was worth fighting for. The decision HBC made in the mid-1990s was not announced. It was not written up in a press release or explained to employees or communicated to customers. It emerged gradually through a pattern of choices that only became legible in retrospect. Store renovation budgets were reduced. Capital expenditure requests from Zellers management were deferred or denied. Technology upgrades that had been discussed for years remained undone. The cash that Zellers generated, and it was still generating significant cash through the mid-1990s, even as Walmart grew, flowed upward to Hudson's Bay Company's broader operations rather than back into the stores that produced it. In plain terms, HBC was using Zellers as a funding source for the rest of its business, while the competition that threatened Zellers most went unanswered. The people who noticed this first were not executives. They were the ones inside the stores. A woman who managed a Zellers in Thunder Bay through this period described what the mid-1990s felt like from the floor. Requests for new shelving units, the old ones were visibly worn, some of them bent and discolored, sat unanswered for months, then years. A lighting upgrade that had been approved in principle never received final budget authorization. Staff levels were trimmed in ways that were individually small but cumulatively significant. Fewer people on the floor meant longer response times, less attentive customer service, a slightly diminished version of the experience that had built the store's reputation. None of it was catastrophic. Each individual cut could be rationalized. But the cumulative effect, over 5 years, was a store that looked and felt like a place where the investment had stopped. Customers noticed, even when they could not have named exactly what they were noticing, the store was still familiar. It was still their store. But something had shifted, a degree of care, a level of polish, a sense that the place was being actively maintained versus simply kept open. The loyalty was strong enough that most of them kept coming, but the margin of forgiveness was narrowing. How long could a company this trusted afford to live off the loyalty it had already earned, without doing the work to earn it again? Meanwhile, Walmart was doing the opposite. The converted Woolco locations were being upgraded. New stores were being built to Walmart's current standards. The supply chain was being refined. Prices were being held at levels that Zellers could not consistently match. And the customer who had driven past the Walmart to go to Zellers in 1994 was, by 1998, more likely to stop at the Walmart on the way. The Club Z program remained a genuine asset through this period. It was one of the few areas where Zellers held a clear advantage, a loyalty infrastructure that Walmart did not have and could not quickly replicate. But a loyalty program is not a substitute for competitive pricing and well-maintained stores. It is an amplifier of a good retail experience. When the retail experience begins to decline, the loyalty program declines with it. Points are not enough to keep a customer in a store where the shelves are understocked and the lighting makes everything look tired. By the turn of the millennium, the trajectory was no longer ambiguous to anyone paying close attention. Zellers was losing ground, not catastrophically, not visibly to the casual observer, but measurably and consistently. Market share was moving toward Walmart in almost every category. The gap between what Zellers needed to invest in its stores and what Hudson's Bay Company was willing to spend continued to widen. The first cracks had become something larger, not a collapse, not yet. But the foundation that had held for 60 years was compromised, and the people responsible for repairing it had already decided quietly and without announcement that the repair was not worth the cost. What happened next happened in boardrooms. In conversations that store managers and customers and long-tenured employees were never part of. In decisions that would be made on their behalf, about the places they had built their working lives around, without ever asking them what those places were worth. By the early 2000s, the Hudson's Bay Company was in trouble, and Zellers was the reason it was still standing. That is not a paradox. It is the precise description of what was happening. The Bay, the flagship department store chain that HBC considered its crown jewel, was losing money. Its downtown locations were expensive to maintain. Its merchandise mix was caught between discount and luxury in a way that satisfied neither customer, and its renovation needs were substantial. The company's real estate portfolio was valuable but illiquid. What HBC had in reliable and continuing quantity was the cash flow generated by Zellers, the discount chain that millions of working-class Canadians still visited every week out of habit, loyalty, and the absence of a fully satisfying alternative. The rational response to this situation would have been to invest in Zellers, to modernize it, sharpen its pricing, renovate its stores, and build it into the kind of operation that could hold its ground against Walmart for another generation. That investment would have cost money in the short term and returned it over time, as a stronger Zellers protected and grew its customer base. HBC chose the other option. Rather than investing the cash Zellers generated back into Zellers, Hudson's Bay Company systematically redirected it. Capital that should have gone into store renovations went elsewhere. Technology budgets that Zellers management had requested, inventory systems, supply chain modernization, the infrastructure of a competitive modern retailer, were approved in principle and deferred in practice, year after year. The stores that customers walked into in 2003 and 2005 were operating on physical infrastructure that had not been meaningfully updated since the late 1980s. The lighting was the same. The shelving was the same. The checkout systems were the same. While Walmart was investing continuously in the operational backbone of its Canadian stores, Zellers was being held in place. Not improved, not modernized, simply maintained at the minimum level required to keep the cash flowing. This is a recognizable pattern in retail history. It has a name in the industry: harvesting. A parent company extracts value from a subsidiary by reducing investment while continuing to collect revenue, accepting the gradual degradation of the asset in exchange for short-term cash. The subsidiary does not collapse immediately. It declines slowly in ways that are individually defensible and collectively fatal. Each deferred renovation is a reasonable cost decision. Each denied technology budget is a prudent allocation of capital. Each reduction in staffing levels is an efficiency improvement. The sum of these reasonable decisions is an unreasonable outcome. A store that has been quietly dismantled from the inside while continuing to present itself to customers as the same place they have always known. The employees saw it most clearly because they lived inside it every day. A long-tenured department manager at a Zellers in London, Ontario, a woman who had worked for the company for over 2 decades, described the experience of watching the store change through the early 2000s, not as a single dramatic moment, but as a slow accumulation of small losses. The stockroom was understaffed, which meant shelves were not replenished as quickly as they should have been. The floor was undermanned, which meant customers who needed help waited longer and sometimes left without finding what they came for. The merchandise mix was becoming less coherent. Products that used to be reliable sellers were being replaced by lower-margin goods that moved slowly and cluttered the floor. The store felt, she said, like a place where the decisions were being made somewhere far away, by people who did not have to live with the consequences. She was right. They were. In 2006, the Hudson's Bay Company was acquired by an American businessman named Jerry Zucker, a private transaction that transferred ownership of one of Canada's oldest institutions to a single individual with no previous experience in retail. Zucker died in 2008, and HBC passed to his estate before being sold in 2008 to NRDC Equity Partners, an American private equity firm. The company that had owned Zellers since 1978, the company that Walter Zeller had sold his chain to 3 decades earlier, was now in the hands of financial operators whose primary expertise was in capital structure, not retail operations. The private equity ownership of HBC did not cause Zellers to fail. The failure was already underway, but it accelerated the logic that had been driving HBC's treatment of Zellers for years. Private equity ownership is oriented toward exit, toward finding the most efficient way to realize the value of an asset and return it to investors. In the case of Zellers, the most efficient value realization was not a turnaround. It was a sale. And who exactly was supposed to protect the 50,000 people who went to work in those stores every morning, when the people making decisions about those stores were calculating exit multiples? The answer, it turned out, was no one. Beginning around 2009, Hudson's Bay Company entered into discussions with Target Corporation, the American discount retailer that had been looking for an entry point into the Canadian market for years. Target had attempted to build a Canadian presence organically and found the real estate landscape difficult to navigate. What Zellers had and what HBC owned was something Target could not easily replicate: 220 existing store locations in established Canadian retail markets, with existing leases, existing infrastructure, and existing customer traffic patterns. Target did not want to buy Zellers the brand. It did not want the merchandise, the management, or the staff. It wanted the real estate. It wanted the leases. It wanted the physical footprint that Zellers had spent 50 years building, the locations in the malls, the anchor positions, the stores in communities across the country where a retailer with Zellers' square footage was extraordinarily difficult to replace. While these negotiations proceeded, Zellers continued to operate. Stores opened every morning. Employees came to work. The layaway counter processed deposits in November. The Club Z points continued to accumulate in wallets across the country. None of the people inside those stores, not the managers, not the long-tenured employees, not the customers who had been shopping there for 30 years, were told what was being decided about the places they depended on. In January 2011, Hudson's Bay Company announced that it had agreed to sell the leases of 220 Zellers locations to Target Corporation for $1.825 billion. The transaction was described in the financial press as a shrewd piece of asset management. HBC had monetized a declining asset at a favorable price. Shareholders would benefit. The balance sheet would be strengthened. In the communities where those 220 stores operated, the announcement landed differently. Store managers heard it on the radio driving to work. Employees learned about it from news websites before anyone from corporate had called. Customers who had been shopping at the same Zellers for 20 years read about it in the morning paper over coffee. No one had asked them. No one had told them it was coming. And no one, in the architecture of the transaction, had been assigned the responsibility of considering what the loss of those stores would mean to the people and communities that had built their daily lives around them. The dark side of the Zellers story is not that a retail chain failed in a competitive market. Retail chains fail. That is part of the industry's history. The dark side is that Zellers did not fail. It was sold, piece by piece, decision by decision, across 15 years of deliberate underinvestment, by people who understood exactly what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. Walter Zeller had built a store for people who needed somewhere to go. The people who owned it at the end decided those people were worth $825 billion in lease value and nothing more. The morning of January 13, 2011 was an ordinary Thursday in most of Canada. Cold in the way that January is always cold. People drove to work, dropped children at school, stopped for coffee. In Zellers stores across the country, managers unlocked the front doors at the usual hour, turned on the lights, and began the day. By mid-morning, the news had moved through every channel simultaneously. Hudson's Bay Company had sold the leases of 220 Zellers locations to Target Corporation for $1.825 billion. The transaction was the largest single real estate deal in Canadian retail history. It would be completed in stages through 2012 and 2013. Most of the affected Zellers stores would close, be stripped, and reopen as Target Canada locations. A small number would be acquired by Walmart. The remainder would simply close. The reaction inside the stores was not what a financial press release would anticipate or describe. A store manager in Hamilton, the city where Walter Zeller had opened the first store 80 years earlier, described hearing the news on the radio during his morning commute. He sat in the parking lot of his store for several minutes before going inside. He had worked for Zellers for 19 years. He did not know in that parking lot whether he still had a job. He did not know whether the people who worked for him still had jobs. No one from corporate had called. No one had sent an email. The announcement had been made to shareholders and the financial press, and the people inside the stores had learned about it the same way everyone else did. From the news. That detail is not incidental. It is the story in miniature. The people who had spent their working lives inside those stores were not part of the conversation about what happened to them. They were the consequence of the conversation, not the subject. In the weeks that followed the announcement, the questions that employees most needed answered took weeks to be addressed. Would Target hire existing Zellers staff? In some locations, yes, but on Target's terms, at Target's wage scales, with no guarantee of seniority or continuity of benefits. Union agreements that had been in place for years did not automatically transfer. Pension entitlements accrued over decades were subject to the specific legal architecture of each situation. The answers, when they came, were complicated and inconsistent, different for different employees in different provinces under different collective agreements. For workers who had been with Zellers for 20 or 25 years, the uncertainty was not abstract. These were people in their 50s, in many cases, who had built their financial planning around the assumption that the job they had held for 2 decades would continue. The severance provisions available to them varied. The job market they faced, at their age and with their specific skill set, was not accommodating. Some found work at other retailers. Some did not. Some retired earlier than they had planned, on less than they had expected. The $1.825 billion that changed hands in that transaction left no particular trace in their lives. The stores themselves began their final chapter at different speeds. Some locations continued operating as Zellers through 2012, running down their inventory, reducing their staff, accepting that they were in a terminal phase even as they remained technically open. Others closed more abruptly. In each case, the pattern was the same. the gradual emptying that signals the end of a retail life. The liquidation sales were not triumphant. They were not the jubilant discount events that liquidation sales are sometimes portrayed as. They were something closer to a public grief, a procession of people walking through a familiar space that was being systematically disassembled around them. Shelves that had been stocked for decades were picked clean and not restocked. Display fixtures were sold off. The red shopping carts, the ones that generations of Canadian children had ridden in, were counted, tagged, and removed. Customers who came in the final weeks were not primarily shopping. They were saying goodbye to a place that had been part of their lives for as long as they could remember, in the only way available to them, by showing up one more time. In March 2013, Target Canada opened its first stores. The launch was accompanied by significant marketing investment and considerable public anticipation. For many Canadians, Target had a specific mythology. The American retailer whose stores, when visited on cross-border shopping trips, seemed brighter, better organized, and more pleasingly designed than anything available at home. The expectation, widely shared and heavily promoted, was that Target Canada would deliver that same experience to the communities where Zellers had been. It did not. The problems with Target Canada's launch were structural and immediate. The supply chain that Target had built for its American operation, refined over decades, optimized for American logistics infrastructure, did not translate cleanly to Canada. The distribution system was underprepared. Shelves in the new Canadian stores were frequently understocked or disorganized in ways that contradicted the brand promise entirely. Products that customers expected to find, items they had seen advertised, items that were available in American Target stores they had visited, were simply not there. The pricing, which Canadians had anticipated would match or approach American Target levels, was consistently and noticeably higher. The experience that had drawn Canadian shoppers across the border on day trips was not what they found when Target came to them. The disappointment was swift and vocal. Canadian consumers who had arrived at the new Target stores with genuine enthusiasm left with specific complaints. Empty shelves, high prices, a store that looked like a Target but did not function like one. Social media in 2013 was already mature enough to give that disappointment immediate national scale. The gap between the brand's promise and its execution became a running conversation in Canadian retail and media circles within weeks of the first openings. Target Canada's management recognized the supply chain problem and worked to address it, but the fixes required time, and the first impression had already been formed. In a retail environment where Walmart had spent nearly 20 years building Canadian customer trust, and where the memory of Zellers was still fresh enough to function as a benchmark, Target Canada needed to be better than expected from the first day. It was worse. The financial losses mounted quickly. Target Canada had entered the market with 133 stores, an aggressive footprint that required strong sales performance across the entire network to justify its cost structure. When those sales did not materialize, the losses were not marginal. They were significant and compounding. By the end of 2013, Target Canada had lost over $900 million. The trajectory did not improve meaningfully in 2014. On January 15, 2015, exactly 4 years and 2 days after HBC had announced the sale of Zellers leases, Target Corporation announced that Target Canada would file for creditor protection and wind down its Canadian operations. All 133 Canadian stores would close. 17,600 employees would lose their jobs. 17,600 people in the same buildings, in the same parking lots, in the same communities where Zellers employees had lost their jobs 2 years earlier. The anchor stores that had defined the retail identity of those locations for 50 years, first as Zellers, then briefly as Target, went dark for the second time in less than 30 months. Is this what Canada exchanged Zellers for? A 2-year experiment that ended with twice the damage and none of the promise? The buildings did not know what they had housed. The parking lots did not remember, but the communities did. In towns and cities across the country, the large retail spaces that had once been Zellers sat empty or were subdivided into smaller tenants or were converted to non-retail uses or simply remained vacant. monuments to a sequence of decisions that had begun in a boardroom in 2009 and ended with locked doors and liquidation notices in 2015. The mall ecosystems that had been built around Zellers anchor stores were particularly vulnerable. When a major anchor departs a mall, especially in a smaller market, the foot traffic that sustained the surrounding smaller retailers departs with it. The Zellers closure had already stressed those ecosystems. The Target failure, in many cases, delivered the final blow. Malls that had been functioning community retail centers in Twintahan were ghost malls by 2016, half empty, struggling, circling a slow drain that the loss of their anchor had opened. The red carts were gone. The popcorn smell was gone. The layaway counter was gone. The Club Z points that had accumulated in millions of wallets across Canada had been rendered worthless years earlier when the program was discontinued. The stores where 3 generations of Canadian families had shopped, worked, and in their own quiet way, belonged, were dark. What was lost was not just a retail chain. What was lost was a place. And in the Canada of 2015, nothing had arrived to replace what that place had been. When the last Zellers stores closed and the Target Canada experiment collapsed, the question that remained was not a retail question. It was a community question. It was a question about what happens to the places people built their daily lives around when those places are taken away. Not by disaster, not by time, but by a sequence of financial decisions made at a distance by people who were never part of those communities and never intended to be. The answer, in most cases, was not much replaced them. The physical spaces that had been Zellers stores, and then briefly Target stores, moved through a predictable succession of outcomes, depending on their location and size. In major urban markets, the large retail footprints were eventually absorbed by other tenants. Walmart expanded into some locations. Dollarama, the Canadian discount chain that had grown steadily through the years when Zellers was declining, took smaller spaces. Home improvement retailers and grocery chains absorbed some of the larger standalone locations. In the cities, the real estate found new purpose, even if what replaced Zellers was rarely a single tenant with the same community function. In smaller markets, the story was different. In towns where the Zellers had been the anchor of a shopping plaza or a small mall, the departure, followed by Target's failure, left vacancies that the local retail market could not fill. A town of 12,000 people does not generate the foot traffic that attracts a national retailer to a 50,000 square foot space. Those spaces sat empty. Some were subdivided. Some were converted to warehouse or light industrial use. Some are still vacant today. The malls around them deteriorated at the pace that anchorless malls deteriorate, slowly at first, then faster, as the remaining smaller tenants lost the foot traffic that had justified their presence and began to leave as their leases expired. The workers who lost their jobs in the Zellers closures of 2013 and the Target Canada collapse of 2015 did not appear in a single news story. Their situations were too numerous, too varied, and too ordinary to sustain media attention. What the record shows in aggregate is consistent with what happens to middle-aged retail workers when the employer they have spent their careers with disappears. Those who were younger and more mobile found other retail positions, often at lower wages than they had been earning. Those who were older, workers in their 50s who had expected to carry a Zellers job through to retirement, faced a labor market that had limited interest in their specific experience. Some retired earlier than planned. Some took part-time work to supplement reduced income. Some did not find equivalent employment. The pension entitlements that had been part of the value proposition of a long-term Zellers career were, in many cases, less than workers had anticipated, subject to the specific provisions of their agreements and the financial condition of the plans that covered them. These are not dramatic stories. They do not have the narrative shape that makes them easy to tell. They are the stories of ordinary people absorbing an ordinary loss. Ordinary in the sense that it happens regularly, in retail and in other industries, whenever a large employer exits a market. The ordinariness is not a mitigation. It is the point. This is what the harvesting of a retail institution looks like at the human level. Not a catastrophe, but a distributed, quiet, persistent diminishment of the lives of people who had no part in the decisions that diminished them. Sears Canada watched all of this happen and did not learn from it. In 2017, Sears Canada filed for creditor protection and began liquidating its remaining stores. Another anchor chain, another wave of closures, another set of mall ecosystems destabilized, another group of long-tenured employees facing the labor market in middle age. The pattern that had played out with Zellers repeated itself with enough similarity that it ceased to be a coincidence and became plainly a systemic feature of how Canadian retail institutions were being managed and disposed of. What do we lose when the places where ordinary people gathered, not to be entertained, not to consume luxury, but simply to take care of their families at a price they could afford, disappear and nothing takes their place? The 2023 revival of the Zellers brand by Hudson's Bay Company is worth examining directly because it illuminates something important about what the brand had been and what it had become. HBC relaunched Zellers as an online retailer in a small format shop within a shop concept inside select Bay locations. The merchandise leaned heavily into nostalgia, retro packaging, references to Club Z. The visual language of the original store applied to a boutique retail concept aimed at consumers who remembered the original. The relaunch generated significant media coverage and genuine public warmth. Canadians who had grown up with Zellers responded to the familiar imagery with the affection that had always been there. But the 2023 Zellers was not a store for working-class families who needed household goods at the lowest available price. It was a nostalgia product, a commercial artifact designed to monetize the emotional equity that the original Zellers had built over 60 years, sold back to the people who had created that equity through decades of loyal shopping. The layaway counter was not coming back. The red carts were not coming back. The snack bar was not coming back. The store that had functioned as a financial service for families who could not access credit, as an employer in communities that needed stable jobs, as a neutral public space where all of Canada could shop together, that store was not coming back. What came back was the logo, and the logo, separated from everything that had made it mean something, is just a design. The lesson of Zellers, if a lesson can be extracted from a story this long and this specific, is not primarily about retail strategy or competitive response or the failure to adapt to e-commerce. Those analyses are available and largely accurate. The lesson is about what institutions are actually for. Zellers, at its best, was not primarily a vehicle for generating returns for its owners. It was a service, a practical, unpretentious, genuinely useful service to the Canadian families who depended on it. When the people responsible for it stopped treating it as a service and started treating it as an asset to be harvested, the service ended. The asset eventually was sold for $1.825 billion. The families got nothing. The communities got empty buildings. And Canada got a lesson that it has not yet demonstrated it has learned. Picture a Saturday morning in November. Somewhere in Canada, the year is 1984 or 1987 or 1991. It does not matter which, because the morning is the same morning. A family pulls into the parking lot of a Zellers. The mother has a list. The father is pushing the cart, red, wide, slightly squeaky on the left rear wheel. A child sits in the basket facing backward, watching the store approach. The automatic doors open and release the smell of popcorn into the cold air, and the child reaches toward it the way children reach toward anything warm. Inside, the fluorescent lights are bright and even. The floors are clean. The shelves run in long, straight rows toward the back of the store, stocked with the ordinary merchandise of Canadian life. School supplies, kitchen goods, winter clothing, hardware, toys. Near the back, the snack bar is already doing business. A grandmother is sharing a hot dog with her granddaughter at one of the small tables, the girl's boots not quite reaching the floor. At the layaway counter, a man in a work jacket is making a payment on something he put down a deposit on 3 weeks ago. He does not rush. The woman behind the counter knows his name. She pulls his paperwork without being asked. This is the store at its truest. Not at its most profitable, not at its most strategically significant. At its truest, doing exactly what Walter Zeller had designed it to do in 1931, in Hamilton, in the middle of a depression, for people who needed somewhere to go. Zellers meant something that is genuinely difficult to replace, and the difficulty is worth naming precisely. It was not the merchandise. The merchandise was ordinary. Household goods, clothing, hardware, toys, things available everywhere, at prices that were competitive but not magical. What was not ordinary was the architecture of the relationship between the store and the people it served. Zellers was built on a foundational premise that sounds simple and is, in practice, remarkably rare. That working class people deserve a good store, not a discount store that reminds you with every visit that you're buying the cheapest version of things. Not a store whose layout and lighting and staffing communicate that the customer is a problem to be processed. A good store, clean, well-stocked, staffed by people who stayed long enough to know their regulars, priced honestly, and committed through 60 years and across the entire country to the proposition that the lowest price was not a marketing position, but a moral obligation to the customer who could not afford to be overcharged. The layaway counter was the purest expression of this. Credit cards existed in the Canada of the 1970s and 1980s. Not everyone had access to them. Not everyone trusted them. Not everyone wanted to carry interest charges on a child's Christmas present. Layaway asked nothing of you except that you show up and pay what you said you would pay, a little at a time. It was a financial instrument designed around trust. The store trusting the customer to come back, the customer trusting the store to hold what they had chosen. That trust, repeated millions of times across 50 years in every province in the country, was the actual product Zellers sold. The merchandise was incidental. The Club Z program was the same trust in a different form. Points were not just a loyalty mechanism. They were a savings instrument for families who did not have many savings instruments available to them. A family that shopped at Zellers every week was, in a small and real way, building something. The points represented future capacity, a hockey stick, a winter coat, a toy that would not otherwise have been under the tree. The program understood its customer well enough to know that the customer valued incremental progress toward a concrete goal. That understanding, that specific practical knowledge of what the working-class Canadian family actually needed, was built into the architecture of the store. When Zellers was gone, that architecture was gone with it. Walmart is a more efficient retailer. Its prices are lower in many categories. Its supply chain is genuinely superior. But Walmart was not built for the Canadian working-class family the way Zellers was built for it. It was built for a global customer, optimized for volume, oriented toward transaction. The relationship it offers is not a relationship. It is a price. And a price, however low, is not the same thing as being known. What Canada lost when it lost Zellers was not a retail chain. It was a particular kind of attention. The attention of a store that had spent 60 years learning who its customers were and building itself around what they needed. That kind of attention, once withdrawn, does not return. It cannot be relaunched with a nostalgia website in retro packaging. It can only be rebuilt from scratch, over decades, by people who understand that the point was never the merchandise. Somewhere tonight, a Canadian in their 60s is telling their grandchild about Club Z points, about the red carts, about the hot dog at the snack bar that costs less than $1 and tasted in the way that food tastes when you are young and the world is simple, like exactly what it was supposed to be. The grandchild will not understand, not entirely. The store is gone. The points are gone. The snack bar is gone. The layaway counter where a generation of Canadian parents kept their promises to their children. Gone. But the grandchild will understand something from the way it is described. From the specific weight the words carry when the person speaking them is not talking about a store, not really, but about a time when the places you depended on dependable, when the institutions built to serve ordinary people actually served them, when a company could be trusted to mean what it said, year after year for 60 years, in every corner of the country. The lowest price is the law. For 60 years in 350 stores across every province in Canada, that law held. It held in Hamilton and Halifax, in Winnipeg and Whitehorse, in the small cities and the large ones, in the malls and the plazas and the standalone stores on the edge of towns that had nothing else quite like it. It held because Walter Zeller built it to hold, because the employees who spent their careers inside those stores held it with him, Because the families who showed up every week with their lists and their Club Z cards and their children in the red carts trusted that it would hold. It did not fail. It was let go. And what was let go? The trust, the attention, the particular and irreplaceable knowledge of what ordinary Canadian families actually needed, that is what deserves to be remembered. Not the bankruptcy filings, not the lease sale, not the Target Canada experiment that turned the same buildings dark a second time. What deserves to be remembered is the Saturday morning in November. The automatic doors, the smell of popcorn in the cold air, the child in the cart reaching toward the warmth. That was real. That was worth something. And it is gone.